News. Well, South Africa boasts 11 official languages with the constitution that supports the protection and the encouragement of multilingualism. But could South Africa do more to protect and utilize our native languages through a language charter? Well, a discussion over a draft declaration of language rights for South Africa is currently underway. And to talk more about this, we are joined in studio by the Executive Head of Corporate Affairs from the Afrikaanse Taal en Kultuur Vereniging, Dr. Danny Titus, as well as language activist Duduzile Ketwe-Mare. A very good evening to you both. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Good evening.
Firstly, let's start, June 16th, marking the uprising of course, that day in the youth bringing the plight on not wanting to be taught in Afrikaans. A couple of years later, a couple of decades later, we're still seeing Afrikaans being the predominant second language that is being taught in schools. Is South Africa progressive in bringing to the fore new languages inclusive of the 11 that we currently have? I'll start with you, Doctor.
Oh, of course. Since June 76, a lot has happened. There's a lot of misconceptions about June 76 as well. Many students, myself included, were part of the uprising in Afrikaans in the Cape, which is something we not always take cognizance of. But beyond that, we have our constitution that has acknowledged 11 languages in our country. We have a constitution that we are very proud of. This process that we are involved in with the language charter is a process not to have anything separate from the constitution, but in furtherance of the aims of the constitution and the legislation, because we've really come a long way trying to implement the requirements of the constitution in terms of multilingualism, in terms of providing what the constitution is saying, that each language should be in equal esteem. But we see the reality is different. We see that students, even parents, choose English, and that indigenous languages in particular are not receiving the treatment that it should. This process we are involved in now around multilingualism is trying to start a process to bring people together and to say, let us develop a civil society initiative, an initiative with public sector institutions, with, for example, your Chapter 9 institutions, the Human Rights Commission, the CRL Commission, etc., to see to it how we can work now at the level where we're supposed to be, and that is the implementation of our constitution, our legislation. That's a difficult part, but we have no other option but to face the difficulties and to realize we have no other option but to give effect to multilingualism in this country.
Now, you mentioned there that a lot of parents are also choosing for their children to be taught in English, but is this not the case? If you look at some of our universities, many of which are also still being taught in English and Afrikaans, if your children do learn in a different language, whether it's Zulu or Xhosa, will they be able to carry that through all the way up to tertiary level? Do we have those structures?
That's precisely the problem, that about over 20 years since our new political dispensation, while the languages were recognized as official languages, not much was put in place to create an environment and of a mental shift attitude for people that our languages need to be used at all domains of life, because basically that's how people live their life. That's how they interact in their own environment. They communicate in their languages, they conceptualize in their own environment, but the minute they move on to school, they begin to be moved away from who they are, from their identity, from interacting with the reality in terms of how they conceptualize, how they interact with the world. And that's why our learners today, they score the lowest in numeracy and literacy, because the minute they go to school, there's that's disharmony where they begin to be taught in a language which is not their primary language, it's not their mother language or father language, if you care to say that. And we are saying now, let's go back to the basics. Let's look at what has gone wrong. We need to be serious about implementing multilingualism in this country at all levels, in education, in politics. And for instance, why can't we have a day or a week where just our parliament, our legislature operates in just African languages, to be able to access everybody, to engage everybody in their own languages?
How can one then start to introduce that on a day-to-day basis? Simple things like going to a store, going to a grocery store, going to a shopping center, and essentially wanting to be addressed in your mother language or your father language.
I think it's a question of small steps, as you say, and we just need to have to take that. And for example, for language speakers to deliberately learn other languages, not necessarily the whole everything about the language, but just greeting, just saying thank you, just getting to the basics, and just to break through that barrier of stepping out of your own language circle. I spoke to a friend this afternoon. He's a minister of religion in Orlando, and he was telling me how he is insisting when it comes to Sunday school and when it comes to catechism classes that those children who want to speak English, to ask them to do assignments in their mother tongue. It's very difficult, but they do it because they find that even at funerals, when children have to just read out a passage of condolences in the mother tongue, they cannot read it out. And they feel as ministry that they need to do something. And he says that at the end of his catechism classes, when the parents hear their children, then the parents are really supporting that. So you see these small little steps that people are doing, which we must also acknowledge and applaud. But the broader question, I mean, you spoke about Parliament. The interpreters in Parliament who are there are falling asleep, we hear, because even parliamentarians don't want to use interpreters in their own languages. Should
society not then take it upon themselves to press to be, taught in their own languages, to have these language shifts? We see the Khoisan, they coming forward, pressing for the preservation of their language. How important is that?
That is very important, that the speakers themselves to begin to value their language, because the speakers invariably have got negative attitude towards their own languages, but it is the examples of what they see around them. They see that we live in an English-orientated society, and for them to be able to access opportunities, they need to learn this language, they need to aspire to this language. But it is because of the leadership, the kind of people that people look up to, aspire to, who are the leaders, who are role models, do not value our languages. If they begin to value our languages, our speakers too, because people look up to leaders for as an example of life, but also again to attach economic values to our languages. The minute they've got economic values, a lot of people learn it. For instance, if for any profession that you're going to work with going to work with communities, at least make an effort of learning in African languages, because we're in Africa. Why can't our white colleagues, our white counterparts make an effort that they learn at least one African language, and that they insist that their children learn African languages? If, for instance, in the previous years we've said, from now on we're going to face in, you want to be a doctor, you want to be an engineer, civil engineer, you're going to be serving various communities, at least make an effort of speaking one of the indigenous languages. We would have moved far by now.
Let's talk about the actual development of the 11 local languages that we actually do have. There are a lot of slang words in some of our languages. Is there not better words that could be developed other than English words that are used in some languages?
Of course there are. Of course there are. And I mean, even the Afrikaans language has so many African languages, African words in there that has been changed, African concepts, and people have not given attention to that at all. And of course, people are speaking in a general sense, in a just vernacular, if you want to say, use it in that way, and use and borrow certain words from each other. But on the other hand, Katibe was one of the speakers at the conference yesterday, and she made the point about something very concrete about plastic. We need to fight the issue of the environmental danger of plastic. And won't it be much better to do that in the local community's language in order to advance your campaign of plastic and explain the dangers much better in the local languages? So it is so practical, but yet we want to use and import English. We're not saying we're fighting with English. We're not saying we find English as a colonial language. Of course it is, but we have endorsed that. But we can do so much more when it comes to furthering service delivery, when it comes to local campaigns to do it in people's own languages as well.
Essentially with the just before we wrap up, essentially with the language charter that is being brought forward, what do you think should be the most important aspects
I think the most important aspect is to begin to say that the language rights that are enshrined in the Constitution must be given life, must come into effect, must be implemented, and also to begin to bring various aspects of what the language issue touches on. Like, for instance, having an access to the legislature and parliament. It says parliament must facilitate access for people to be involved in legislation making processes, be it a provincial or national level or local government level. But access is not just physically arriving there. Access is being able to communicate, to hear, and to be heard in your own languages. That's one of the things that the Charter is hoping will mobilize people around that, and to begin to bring various streams of the language rights, language issues that are enshrined in various pieces of legislation and even the Constitution in one main document that will begin to give effect to our Constitution as well. But also when we speak language, we also speak about social cohesion, that we're not speaking languages in silos, that we see languages existing in silos away from each other. We live in an integrated society, in a democratic society, and that democratic society requires democratic practices. And those democratic process means whatever we do needs to be mediated and is communicated and should be communicated across all our languages. Speaking
of which, South Africa is relatively metropolitan. What about the introduction of international languages, so that when, you know, our South Africans do go abroad, whether it's to study, whether it's to participate in business, that they can also communicate with the international community, your languages such as French or Mandarin?
The basic is that you learn your language. The minute you can conceptualize your language, we are not saying people should not learn other languages. Start with the basics. Start where you are. Learn your own languages. Learn English. We're even not stuck against the English, as my colleague has said here, but add into what you've got. We can't start on Mandarins when our own languages are on the margins, when our own children do not even speak their own languages, and they cannot pass, they cannot conceptualize at high level domains because they don't even know the basics in their own language. The minute they start to seriously learn and engage in their own languages, conceptualize, understanding better, comprehend, then they'll be able to add languages. We're talking about additive multilingualism, because so far what we've seen is subtractive monolingualism of English only.
Your closing remarks very briefly.
Well, at the moment we are working on a very inclusive process. We are inviting people to participate in the process. We have started with the concept document, which we are circulating now amongst people, and we would like to have a follow-up as soon as possible, so that my organization, the Arctic Affair, many other organizations get together so that we can move on this process. And we think that we are living in a multilingual world, and South Africans speak other languages. South Africans speak Portuguese, they speak French, they speak. I lived in Holland for 6 years. We adapted to those areas, but you come back to your country and you find that here we have so much that we need to share still amongst each other, and language is so crucial in that sharing of our diversity.
Definitely. Thank you very much for your time this evening. Of course, the head of corporate affairs, executive there from the Afrikaanse Taal en Kultuur Vereniging, Dr. Danny Titus, as well as language activist Duduzile Ketiwe. We'll take a